moments in life when you feel like the walls are closing in. You pray, but heaven seems silent. You cry, but no one wipes your tears. You push forward, but the weight of life drags you back. Some of you have been fighting battles no one knows about, carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. You've asked God, where are you? Have you forgotten me? Do you see my pain? But I came to tell you today, God is working on your behalf, right now, in the silence, in the struggle, in the waiting. He is moving. Do you remember Joseph? He was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and locked in a prison for a crime he didn't commit. He had every reason to believe God had abandoned him. But what Joseph couldn't see was that every betrayal, every setback, every lonely night was positioning him for something greater. When the time was right, God took him from the prison to the palace, from being forgotten to being second in command over all of Egypt. The very ones who betrayed him had to come back to him for help. And Joseph stood there, not as a bitter man, but as a man who had seen the hand of God move in ways he never expected. And the same God who worked behind the scenes for Joseph is working behind the scenes for you. You may not see it now, but that closed door was for your protection. That delay was for your preparation. That heartbreak was for your transformation. When the enemy whispered, "It's over," God was declaring, "I've only just begun." Some of you are in the middle of your battle. The night seems long. The valley seems deep. You don't know how you'll make it, but listen to me. God has not brought you this far to leave you. You are not forgotten. You are not forsaken. The same God who walked with Daniel in the lion's den, who stood with David before Goliath, who parted the Red Sea for Moses, that God is with you right now. I remember a woman who lost everything overnight. Her business collapsed, her family turned against her, and she was on the verge of giving up. She said, "I don't understand. I've been faithful, I've prayed, I've trusted. Why is this happening?" But God wasn't finished. What she thought was the end was only the beginning. Out of her greatest pain came her greatest blessing. She rebuilt stronger than before, and today she looks back and says, "Had I not gone through that storm, I would have never discovered the strength God placed inside me." God is not just watching your struggle, He is working through it. The pain, the tears, the lonely nights, they are not wasted. Every tear you've cried, He has seen. Every prayer you've whispered, He has heard. And when the time is right, when you are ready, He will open doors no man can shut. So do not grow weary, do not lose heart. What the enemy meant for evil, God will turn for your good. Keep believing, keep trusting, keep moving forward, because your breakthrough is coming. Your victory is near, and your story is far from over. God is working on your behalf. There are times in life when it feels like nothing is happening. You've prayed, you've hoped, you've believed, but the situation remains unchanged. The silence is deafening and doubt begins to creep in. You wonder if God has forgotten about you, if He's abandoned you in your struggle. But the truth is, God is working even when you don't see it. Think about the seed planted deep in the soil. To the human eye, nothing is happening. The ground looks the same day after day, but beneath the surface, something powerful is taking place. The roots are growing, the foundation is strengthening, and at just the right time, that seed will break through the ground. Your life is no different. Just because you can't see God moving doesn't mean He's not at work. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with the Egyptian army closing in, they saw no way out. Fear gripped their hearts and they thought it was over. But while they were panicking, God was making a way. He was orchestrating a miracle that would leave generations in awe. In a moment, the waters parted, and what seemed impossible became possible. God is doing the same in your life. The doors that haven't opened, the answers that haven't come, the prayers that seem unheard, none of it means God is inactive. He is moving pieces you don't even know exist. He is shifting things in your favor, aligning opportunities, preparing people, and setting the stage for his perfect plan. A delay does not mean denial. Silence does not mean absence. Just because you can't see it with your natural eyes doesn't mean he isn't working in the supernatural. Sometimes God allows you to walk through the valley to prepare you for the mountaintop. He refines your character, strengthens your faith, and teaches you to trust him, not the timing, not the circumstances, but him alone. So don't let the silence shake you. Don't let the waiting make you weary. You may not see it, but God is at work in the background, orchestrating a victory that will exceed your greatest expectations. When the time is right, when the foundation is ready, you will see what he has been doing all along. Keep trusting, keep believing, because he is always working, even when you don't see it. Life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it. You set out with dreams, plans, and expectations, but then come the betrayals, the disappointments, the failures. You give your best, yet the door slams shut. You work hard, yet nothing seems to change. It's in these moments that doubt creeps in, whispering, maybe this is the end. Maybe this is as far as I go. But what if the setback you're facing isn't the end of your story? What if it's the setup for something greater? Look at Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, but instead of rising to the top, he found himself at the bottom, sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison. Every step seemed to take him further from his destiny. But what Joseph didn't know was that every hardship was a setup. The betrayal put him in Egypt. The false accusation placed him in the king's prison. And the prison positioned him to interpret Pharaoh's dream, which led him to the palace. What seemed like defeat was divine positioning. God does not waste your pain. The doors that close, the failures that break your heart, the seasons of waiting, they all have a purpose. Sometimes God removes people from your life because they can't go where he's taking you. Sometimes he allows delays because you aren't ready for what he has prepared. Sometimes he lets you face failure so you can develop the strength to carry the success that's coming. What feels like a breakdown is often the foundation for your breakthrough. The setbacks in your life are not there to destroy you, they are there to develop you. What the enemy meant for harm, God is using for good. Every disappointment, every rejection, every closed door is setting you up for something greater than you can imagine. The very thing that seems like it's holding you back is actually positioning you for your purpose. Stay the course. The setup is happening even when you can't see it. Waiting can feel like the hardest thing to do. You pray, you prepare, you expect, but nothing seems to change. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and still the breakthrough doesn't come. The longer you wait, the more the doubt creeps in. Maybe I misheard God. Maybe it's not meant to be. Maybe I should just settle. But what if the delay isn't a denial? What if it's divine preparation for something greater than you imagine? Look at Abraham. God promised him a son, but years passed and still there was no child. The waiting became so unbearable that he and Sarah tried to force the promise by taking matters into their own hands. But God's plan was never in question, only his timing. When the moment was right, when Abraham was fully ready, Isaac was born. The delay wasn't God changing his mind, It was God ensuring that the promise came at the perfect time. When you plant a seed, you don't see the growth immediately. You water it, care for it, and trust that beneath the soil something is happening. The roots are forming. The foundation is strengthening, even though to the naked eye there is no evidence of change. Your life is no different. God is growing something beneath the surface. He is deepening your character, strengthening your faith, and preparing you for what's coming. If he gave it to you too soon, it might overwhelm you. If he answered too early, you might not be able to handle it. Moses knew he was called to deliver Israel, but when he tried to do it in his own strength, he failed. He spent 40 years in the wilderness, not because he was forgotten, but because he was being forged. The delay wasn't punishment, it was preparation. When the time came, he was no longer an impulsive prince. He was a leader strong enough to carry the weight of a nation's deliverance. God's delays are not his denials. What looks like a standstill is actually a setup. The waiting season is not wasted time. It's the proving ground for your destiny. Every moment of patience, every step of faith, every unanswered question is building something within you that will sustain you when the promise comes. Don't mistake silence for absence. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean he isn't working. The promise still stands, and when the time is right, nothing will stop it from coming to pass. Rejection can feel like the deepest kind of wound. You pour your heart into something and the door slams shut. You chase an opportunity and it slips through your fingers. You invest in a relationship and they walk away. In those moments, it's easy to believe that you've been overlooked, forgotten, or cast aside. But what if the rejection wasn't meant to hurt you? What if it was God's way of protecting you from something you couldn't see? Think of a child reaching for something dangerous. They cry when their parent pulls them away, not understanding that what they wanted could have harmed them. That's how we are with God. We see what we want, what we think is best, but he sees beyond that. He sees what's waiting down the road. He sees the pain that would come if he let us have our way. The job you didn't get may have led you into a toxic environment. The relationship that ended may have saved you from heartbreak you never saw coming. The door that closed may have kept you from settling for less than what he had planned. David wanted to build the temple, but God said no. It wasn't because David wasn't faithful, but because God had something different in mind. Instead of letting David build it, he chose his son Solomon to complete the task. David could have been bitter, but instead he trusted God's wisdom. What looks like a rejection is often a redirection. God isn't just saying no, he's saying, I have something better. Hannah prayed for years for a child, but it seemed like God had shut the door. What she didn't know was that the delay wasn't a denial. It was because God was preparing to give her a son, Samuel, who would become one of the greatest prophets in history. Had she received a child earlier, it wouldn't have been the right one at the right time. What you think is rejection is really protection. What seems like a loss is often a setup for a greater gain. Don't mourn over what didn't work out. Trust that if God removed it, he has something better. His plan is always greater than what you could imagine. And when he closes a door, it's because he's getting ready to open the right one. Keep walking, keep trusting, and soon you'll see why it had to happen this way. Pain is never easy. It cuts deep, leaving scars that don't always heal quickly. The disappointments, the betrayals, the losses, they shake you to your core. You wonder why it had to happen, why you had to go through it, why God allowed it. But what if the pain you're feeling isn't meant to break you, but to build you? What if the very thing you wish never happened is the thing that will push you into your purpose? Joseph's brothers threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, and left him for dead. He was falsely accused and imprisoned for years. If anyone had a reason to be bitter, it was him. But when he finally stood before the same brothers who had betrayed him, he didn't seek revenge. Instead, he said, "What you meant for evil, God turned for good." The pain of his past became the foundation for his future. If he hadn't been betrayed, he would never have made it to Egypt. If he hadn't been imprisoned, he would never have met the person who would introduce him to Pharaoh. And if he hadn't met Pharaoh, he wouldn't have been in a position to save millions from famine, including the very brothers who hurt him. What seemed like a curse was actually the very thing that led to his calling. When Jesus went to the cross, it looked like the ultimate defeat. The people mocked him, the disciples scattered, and for a moment it seemed like all hope was lost. But what the world saw as tragedy, God had already planned as victory. The pain of the cross led to the power of the resurrection. The suffering led to salvation. Without the pain of Friday, there would be no triumph of sin. God never wastes pain. Every tear, every heartbreak, every trial is shaping you, refining you, making you stronger. The things you thought would destroy you are actually preparing you for something greater. The storm isn't there to drown you, it's there to deepen your roots. The fire isn't there to burn you, it's there to refine you like gold. Pain has a way of making you question everything. It hits without warning, leaving you gasping for answers, searching for meaning. The betrayal of someone you trusted, the loss of a dream you worked for, the disappointment that feels like a dead end, these moments shake you to your core. You wonder why you have to go through this, why God allowed it, why the road had to be so hard. But what if the pain you're walking through isn't meant to destroy you, but to shape you? What if the very thing you wish never happened is the thing God is using to lead you into your purpose? Joseph never imagined that the dreams God gave him would first lead him into a pit, then to slavery, then to prison. Every step of the journey seemed like a step away from his destiny. The people closest to him betrayed him. He was falsely accused. He was forgotten. Yet in the middle of his suffering, God was positioning him. Every painful moment, every unfair setback was leading him to the palace. And when the time came, he stood before the very brothers who betrayed him and said, "What you meant for evil, God turned for good." The pain that could have broken him was the very thing that prepared him for his purpose. When Jesus hung on the cross, it looked like the ultimate defeat. The people mocked him, the disciples lost hope, and for a moment it seemed like all was lost. But what looked like the worst moment in history was actually the greatest victory the world had ever seen. Without the suffering of the cross, there would be no resurrection. Without the pain, there would be no redemption. The suffering wasn't pointless, it was the path to salvation. God never wastes pain. Every tear you've cried, every night you've spent wondering why, every moment you thought you wouldn't make it, it's not wasted. God is using it. The fire you're walking through isn't there to burn you, it's there to refine you. The storm isn't there to drown you. You may not understand it now, but one day you'll look back and see how every struggle, every heartbreak, every painful moment was actually part of God's plan. What was meant to break you will be the very thing that builds you into everything He created you to be. Faith is easy when life is smooth, when prayers are answered quickly, when doors open effortlessly. But what happens when everything falls apart? When the report isn't good, when the job is lost, when the relationship ends, when nothing seems to be going right. In those moments, fear creeps in, whispering that it's over, that things will never change. But faith isn't about what you see. It's about believing in what God has promised, even when everything around you says otherwise. The Israelites stood at the edge of the Red Sea, trapped between the water and an advancing army. Fear gripped them, and they cried out, convinced that death was inevitable. But while they saw an ending, God saw a way. While they focused on the enemy behind them, God was preparing to part the sea in front of them. What looked like an impossible situation was actually the setup for one of the greatest miracles in history. If they had run, if they had given in to fear, they would have never witnessed the power of God making a way where there was none. Faith moves mountains, but sometimes before the mountain moves, God moves in you. Sometimes he doesn't take away the struggle right away because he's strengthening you in the process. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't spared from the fiery furnace. They were thrown into it. But because of their unwavering faith, the fire didn't consume them. Instead, the Son of God walked with them in the flames. The miracle wasn't just that they survived. The miracle was that their faith remained unshaken, even in the face of death. God never promised a life without trials, but he did promise that he would never leave you. He did promise that no weapon formed against you would prosper. He did promise that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can speak to the mountain and it will move. The enemy wants you to focus on the storm, but God wants you to focus on him. Your breakthrough is coming, but faith is required to reach it. You may not see it now, but just like the Red Sea parted, just like the fire lost its power, just like the stone rolled away from the tomb, God is working. Keep believing, keep trusting. Even the darkest times, faith is the key that unlocks the miracle waiting on the other side. When life throws its hardest battles at you, it can feel like everything is against you. The setbacks, the disappointments, the betrayals. Sometimes it seems as though the enemy is winning. You pray, but things get worse. You believe, but doors remain closed. You push forward, but obstacles keep rising. It's in these moments that doubt whispers, maybe God has forgotten me. Maybe this is where it ends. But what you must remember is this: no attack of the enemy can stop what God has ordained for your life. Look at Joseph. His brothers hated him. They threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison. It seemed as though everything was working against him. But what they didn't realize was that God's hand was on Joseph the entire time. Every betrayal, every hardship, every setback was actually pushing him toward his destiny. The very people who tried to destroy him were unknowingly positioning him for greatness. And when Joseph finally stood as second in command over all of Egypt, he looked at his brothers and said, "What you meant for evil, God turned for good." The enemy's attacks only propelled him into God's plan. Daniel was thrown into a lion's den because he refused to stop praying. The enemy thought it was over. The people who plotted against him thought they had won. But what they didn't realize was that God had already gone before Daniel. He shut the mouths of the lions. What was meant to destroy him became the very thing that displayed God's power. Jesus himself faced the ultimate attack. The enemy thought the cross would be his defeat. The people who mocked him thought it was over. But what they didn't know was that the very thing meant to destroy him was actually setting up the greatest victory in history. The cross was not the end, it was the beginning. 3 days later he rose, proving once and for all that no power in hell can stop the plan of God. The enemy may try to block your path, but he cannot change your destiny. He may attack, but he cannot overcome the one who is fighting for you. No weapon formed against you will prosper. What was meant for harm, God will turn for your good. Keep standing, keep believing. What the enemy meant to break you will be the very thing God uses to lift you higher. There are moments in life when everything feels still, as if nothing is moving forward. You've prayed, you've worked hard, you believed, but nothing seems to change. The silence can be deafening, making you question if God is even listening. You start to wonder if He has forgotten you, if your prayers are bouncing off the walls, if the promises you once held on to were just wishful thinking. But what you don't realize is that the silence of God does not mean the absence of God. Just because you can't see Him working doesn't mean He isn't moving behind the scenes. Think of a seed planted deep in the soil. It sits in darkness, buried, hidden from sight. There is no sign of growth, no evidence that anything is happening, but beneath the surface, something powerful is taking place. Roots are stretching out, foundations are being built, and in due time the seed will break through the ground. Your life is the sign way. The silence is not a sign of abandonment, it's a season of preparation. God is establishing your roots, strengthening your faith, and making sure that when He brings you into your next season, you will be ready to sustain it. Look at Noah. God told him to build an ark, but there was no rain. Day after day, year after year, he hammered and worked while people mocked him. He had no proof that a flood was coming, only a word from God. It would have been easy to give up, to doubt, to stop, but Noah stayed faithful. And in the right moment, when God's timing was fulfilled, the rain came and everything changed. Lazarus was dead for 4 days. His family mourned, believing it was over. They had sent word to Jesus earlier, but He didn't come right away. To them, His delay was devastating. But what they didn't know was that the delay was intentional. Jesus didn't just want to heal Lazarus, He wanted to resurrect him. Sometimes what feels like a denial is actually a setup for a greater miracle. God's silence is never without purpose. Just because you don't hear Him doesn't mean He isn't working. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean He isn't making a way. Trust in the unseen. Hold on to His promises. When the time is right, the silence will break, and everything He has been preparing will come to pass in ways greater than you ever imagined. Life is filled with moments of uncertainty, struggle, pain, and waiting. At times it feels as though God is distant, as if the prayers have gone unanswered and the dreams have been delayed indefinitely. But through every trial, every closed door, every season of silence, one truth remains unshaken. God is working on your behalf. What seemed like rejection was actually redirection. What felt like a setback was divine preparation. The suffering you endured wasn't wasted. It was refining you, strengthening you, preparing you for something greater than you imagined. The enemy may have tried to break you, but God has been using every attack to build you. The fire wasn't meant to destroy you, it was meant to refine you. The delay wasn't a denial, it was a setup for something bigger than you ever dreamed. Joseph's betrayal led him to the palace. David's wilderness season prepared him for the throne. The cross, meant to be Jesus' defeat, became the symbol of ultimate victory. And just as God was working behind the scenes in their lives, He is working in yours. He has not forgotten you. He has not abandoned you. His silence does not mean His absence. Keep believing, keep standing, keep moving forward. When the time is right, the doors will open, the breakthroughs will come, and the purpose behind every trial will be revealed. What was meant for evil, God will turn for good, and when you look back, you will see that He was working all along and turning every challenge, every tear, and every trial into a testimony of His faithfulness.